We were told the Apollo missions ended in 1972. They didn't. They were stopped. If you ask most people of a certain age who the first British person in space was, they'll tell you it was Helen Sharman in 1990. And if you ask them who the first Briton to walk on the moon was, they'll give you a blank stare. The official answer is correct. No British person has ever walked on the moon. But the official truth is a carefully tended garden, hiding what grows in the wild soil beneath. What they don't tell you is that in the final, gasping days of the Soviet Union, a secret was buried. Not in the steppes of Russia, but in the gray dust of the Sea of Serenity. A secret that involved us. A secret about what was already there. And what it wanted from us. My name is irrelevant. I was, and remain, bound by laws written in invisible ink. The Official Secrets Act has teeth that reach decades. The few documents I ever held were fed to a furnace in a Whitehall basement, their ashes scattered to some nameless incinerator wind. But memory is a harder thing to burn. I can tell you when it began for me. June 1989. The specifics of the date are fogged by time and deliberate obfuscation, but the feeling is etched in ice, the sudden, jarring interruption of an ordinary life. I was in my university study, surrounded by the comforting smell of old paper and dust, when two men entered without knocking. They wore suits the color of a starless night and carried an aura of absolute authority. "Professor," the taller one said, his voice devoid of inflection. "You're required." Immediately. I scoffed, thinking it a prank by colleagues with a warped sense of humor. Required by whom? And for what? The whom is not your concern. The what will be explained. Come. There was no argument to be had. It wasn't a request. It was a gravitational pull, and I was a speck of dust caught in its wake. They escorted me to a car waiting ominously at the curb, a Jaguar, I think, sleek and black as a hearse. The journey to London was a silent purgatory. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of a CB radio as the passenger received terse, coded updates. Any lingering belief that this was a joke evaporated when I was deposited in a small, windowless room deep in the bowels of Westminster. The air was still, smelling of expensive wool carpet and old fear. I had time to count the patterns in the fabric before the door burst open. About a dozen men filed in, a wave of grim-faced intensity. Some were British, civil servants with eyes like flint. Others were Russian, their features carved from harder stone, voices a low rumble of guttural consonants. They carried thick folders spilling over with papers, arguing amongst themselves in a jargon soup of politics and jargon. I was furniture to them, for the moment. Then, an older Russian, a man whose very posture screamed command, slammed a hand on the table. The room fell silent. The last time a human being set foot on the moon, he declared, his accent thick, was December 14, 1972. Almost 20 years ago. We must know if they are still up there. I was confused. The Apollo 17 crew returned safely. The whole world saw it. A collective, weary sigh moved through the room. All eyes turned to me, some pitying, most irritated. The old Russian fixed me with a stare that could freeze magma. "Do you think," he said slowly, each word a drop of cold water, "we were fearful of mere humans being on the moon?" The absurdity of my assumption hit me. Of course not. If astronauts had been left behind, they'd have been dead within days. This was about something else. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was far more frightening than any shout. "You have not, nor will you ever have, any idea of what we know was up there." He slid a stapled sheaf of papers across the table. The cover was stamped with one word in bold, block letters, classified, level 7. "I assume you were not briefed, comrade," he said. I let the comrade slide. I turned the page. My world tilted. The first image was a lunar landscape, stark black and white. But in the distance, blurry yet unmistakable, was a structure. It wasn't a rock formation. It had angles, symmetry. It was built. The second photo was a lunar module. Or what was left of one. It lay on its side, not crumpled from a crash, but sliced open from top to bottom. The edges of the tear were smooth, clean, as if made by a cosmic scalpel. Cyrillic lettering was visible on the unharmed section. The third image stole the breath from my lungs. A Soviet-era spacesuit lay empty on the regolith. The helmet visor was shattered. Around it, strewn like grotesque confetti, were the frozen, mangled remains of its occupant. It looked as if the cosmonaut had been extracted through the broken faceplate with tremendous, violent force. The fourth showed a cluster of other suits, maybe 24, discarded like empty shells about 75 yards from the camera. My stomach churned. I fought to keep my composure. Russian lunar landing, the old man, I later learned his name was Krantsov, said flatly. October 1968. Those Americans thought they would get there first. They thought our technology was inferior. They were wrong. A British man across the room stubbed out his cigarette directly on the polished table. For Christ's sake, Krantsov, spare us the bloody propaganda and get to the point. Krantsov didn't flinch. We landed. 6 kilometers from where Apollo 17 would land 4 years later. Radio contact was lost 5 hours after touchdown. We assumed a plutonium fuel cell failure. A secret victory, a secret tragedy. The men involved, their families were told they died in training accidents. This was the way of things. He let that hang in the air. I was starting to connect horrific dots. The Americans landed in '69, Krantsov continued. And again, and again. On December 22, 1972, we received a communication from our contacts in NASA. He nodded to a man I hadn't noticed, sitting in the corner. The man had a Texan drawl, but his eyes were the same dead serious shade as everyone else's. That's right, the American said. Apollo 17. They'd found our LK lander. They sent images. Confirmed it was ours. Then they found the rest. Tell him what your crew found, comrade, Krantsov ordered. The American's jaw tightened. Human remains. Decapitated. Mutilated beyond anything. Soon after, the 3 astronauts unanimously demanded an immediate return to Earth. We told them it was impossible, the command module orbit was wrong. They were trapped in that tin can on the surface. He took a shaky breath. They reported seeing figures outside, moving amongst their discarded equipment. These men were 20 feet away from whatever they were, with only the lunar module's hull between them. Those holes are meant for vacuum and micrometeoroids, not for physical attack. A cold terror was crystallizing in my chest. So if this happened, I stammered, why did the Apollo 17 crew look so normal when they came home? The parades, the smiles. The American almost smiled himself, a bitter, ghastly twist of his lips. Of course they looked happy. The men the world saw that day had never been closer to space than their television sets. The real crew, they were in no fit state for public consumption. What do you mean? Mentally, they were shattered. We had to sedate them to get them to eat. They babbled. One of them, when he was coherent, described the figures. He said they were like a black patch of shadow with a menacing stare. He said one looked right at him through the module window. The American paused, his voice dropping. He said it didn't have eyes, it just stared straight into his soul. Plundered his thoughts. Projected pure fear directly into his mind. The room was tomb silent. I looked down at the document in my sweat-slick hands. I turned to the final page. It was another photo, taken from inside a lander, looking out a small window. It was grainy, blurred, but it showed one of the figures. The figure. It was a silhouette of impossible darkness, outlined against the gray lunar soil. It was tall, 8, 9 feet maybe, with elongated, spindly limbs that ended not in hands, but in sharp, tapered points. It had no discernible features, just a shape that screamed wrongness into the visual cortex. So, I finally managed, my voice a dry rasp. What does this have to do with me? A British civil servant cleared his throat. You are a professor of psychology. A specialist in extreme trauma and perceptual distortion. We are planning another mission. A joint, deniable venture. If the crew encounters influences, we need you to be ready to treat them. To bring their minds back. I laughed, a short, hysterical bark. You can't be serious. You want to send men back to that slaughterhouse? After what happened to the last ones? You've just shown me proof of an extraterrestrial predator, and your response is to offer it more food and ask me to tidy up the psychological mess. Krantsov's expression didn't change. We have our reasons for selecting you. Your case file from your work at St. Jude's Asylum was impressive. You meet the criteria. Now I was angry. 18 months in a mental hospital qualifies me to treat men whose sanity has been shredded by literal monsters? You have no idea how this works. Why would you even go back? We must know, Krantsov said simply. Knowledge is the only defense. It's suicide. He pushed the folder closer to me. Take these. Read them. If you change your mind, contact us. His tone made it clear he expected compliance. My mind was screaming no, but to avoid further confrontation, I took the papers. The two silent men reappeared and drove me back to my university. I shoved the folder into a box in my study, determined to forget it. I remember the mission details, though they tried to burn them from me. Selene 9. Launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome, December 22, 1990. Crew of 3, 1 British, 2 Russians. I never learned their names. I didn't want to. For 7 months, I succeeded in forgetting. Then, in January 1991, the phone rang. I was to be picked up. I was to bring the documents. I refused, vehemently. I was told my role was changed, no psychological duties. I was just to attend. Reluctantly, I went. This time, I was taken to the basement. Krantsov was there, alone, standing under a single bare bulb. He looked older, hollowed out. The mission was a failure, he said, without preamble. Communication loss? Mechanical failure? Neither. His eyes were pools of dread. The equipment functioned perfectly. Until we saw what happened on the video feed. The ice in my veins returned. The figures? They were waiting. The module hadn't even finished settling in the dust before they were upon it. He described it in a flat, dead voice. It wasn't an attack. It was a dissection. At 3:47 Christmas morning, on the live feed, we watched the crew decapitated inside their own lander. At 3:48, every printer in Mission Control started spooling out the same message, over and over. What did it say? He recited it from memory, each word a shard of glass. You have been warned. The silence is not empty. It is occupied. Return, and the occupants will visit you. The war will be brought home. The mind is the battlefield. The horror was now complete, a perfect, terrible circle. So what now? I whispered. Now, we bury it. He held out his hand. I gave him the folder. He led me to a small side room, opened a heavy metal chute. An inferno's breath wafted up. Without ceremony, he fed the pages into the fire. The evidence vanished in a curl of flame and ash. As long as you made no copies, he said, turning to me, officially, this never happened. He extended his hand. I didn't take it. He nodded, as if expecting this. We may need you again, comrade. Next time, your assistance will be mandatory. He turned and walked into the gloom, leaving me alone in the basement with the smell of burnt secrets. I thought that was the end. I was wrong. It was just the end of the first act. 6 years passed. The Soviet Union collapsed. The world moved on, blissfully ignorant. I took a position at Broadmoor, the high-security hospital. My work was with the most broken minds, those fractured by internal demons. I never forgot the external ones. In 1997, I attended a psychology convention in West London. In the hotel bar, a voice cut through the murmur. "Comrade! Over here!" My blood ran cold. It was Krantzoff. He was dressed in an expensive, slightly flashy suit, a brandy in one hand, a cigar in the other. The stern Soviet commander was gone, replaced by a man who looked like a prosperous, if shady, businessman. Our meeting was not accidental. He'd tracked me down. We made small talk, but the subtext thrummed between us. Eventually, he suggested a more private venue. We retreated to my hotel room. "What are you now, Krantzoff?" I asked. "A capitalist?" He laughed, a rich, genuine sound. "When Mother Russia fell, I did what any smart man did. I took advantage. I was in charge of liquidating surplus military assets. Tanks, planes, bullets. My instructions were simple: sell for the best price, send money to Moscow." He leaned forward, his eyes glinting. "But when you are selling 100 tanks, it is easy for paperwork to say 70. Suddenly, I have 30 tanks to sell for myself." The people who knew didn't care. The people who cared never knew. A few envelopes of $100 bills work wonders. He had become a war profiteer, a king of the gray market. But his smile faded when I steered the conversation back to the moon. "What really happened, Krantzoff? With them?" He grew sober, the facade dropping. "We should never have gone back in '90. It was arrogance. But after '68, we didn't just run. We listened." Listened? To the radio signals. After the LK lander went silent, a new signal began broadcasting on an encrypted Soviet frequency. It was a communication. Not from the foot soldiers. From whatever commanded them. The idea was worse than mindless monsters. Intelligent, communicating evil. What did they want? At first? Nothing. They offered a gift. A solution to a problem. He explained that Soviet science had been struggling with semiconductor design, the tiny brains of modern electronics. They'd hit a wall with germanium. On a whim, a desperate scientist had uplinked their schematics and chemical formulae to the moon, on the frequency the signal used. A plea into the dark. A month later, Krantzoff whispered, a return signal came. Not words. Data. Schematics. Chemical recipes. It advised replacing germanium with silicon. It provided formulas for new photolithographic solutions. We built them. They worked. Flawlessly. Our computing power leapt forward a generation. I was stunned. They helped you? They helped everyone, he said grimly. Our agents in the US obtained samples of their cutting-edge chips. The architecture was identical. The Americans were getting the same help. The technological explosion of the 70s and 80s, the microchip, the personal computer, guided missiles, it wasn't just human ingenuity. It was assisted. They were giving the whole planet a leg up. Why? The question felt pathetic, childlike. Because every gift has a price. They finally stated theirs. They wanted to conduct experiments. On the moon? No, Krantzoff's face was pale. On Earth. On us. Psychological, sociological experiments. They wanted to introduce variables into the human population and study the results. They wanted our cooperation in letting these variables move freely, without interference. The chill was back, deeper than ever. What kind of variables? He didn't answer directly. Instead, he asked, do you believe in God, comrade? The non sequitur threw me. I'm agnostic. A good answer, he said, nodding. They have conducted experiments before. Over centuries. They altered the psyche of certain individuals. Gave them visions, convictions, a compelling narrative. People called them prophets. The room seemed to shrink. I wanted to laugh, to dismiss it as the ramblings of a traumatized man. But his eyes held a truth too terrible to be a lie. You're saying religion was an alien experiment? Some of it. We don't know which parts. They know it was successful. It shaped your planet. Now, they want to run a new trial. An inverse. Anti-prophets? The term felt vile in my mouth. We don't know what form it will take. But they gave a start date. He looked at me, and in his gaze, I saw genuine, human fear. They said they would begin when our planet completed 2,000 rotations after the birth of one of their previous test subjects. The maths was terrifyingly simple. The year 2000. The new millennium, Krantzoff confirmed. My belief is they will turn small groups against the many. Not for land or money, but for a twisted ideology, a false faith planted generations ago as a sleeper agent in our cultural DNA. A ready-made army of the convinced, waiting for a signal from heaven that actually comes from the dark side of the moon. We sat in silence for a long time. The weight of it was crushing. We weren't just prey. We were a petri dish. Before he left, Krantzoff noticed my camera. He insisted I take his picture, a bizarre slice of normality. He joked about wanting a copy. I never saw him again. The world celebrated the year 2000 with fireworks and hope. I watched the clock tick over with a knot of dread in my stomach. Nothing happened. No angels fell, no demons rose. Life went on. The fear slowly receded, becoming a background hum, a psychiatrist's private paranoia. I was wrong. The experiment didn't begin with a bang. It began with a whisper. It was the small things first, things easily explained away. A noted environmental activist, once a pillar of calm reason, began giving speeches that weren't just about saving trees, but about punishing humanity for its sins, describing industry not as flawed, but as a literal demonic force that needed to be purged in blood. His eyes, in interviews, had a flat, fanatical sheen that reminded me of the descriptions from Apollo 17. Then it was a fringe political leader in Europe, whose rhetoric shifted overnight from nationalist pride to a terrifying, cohesive doctrine of purity that spoke of cleansing shadows and the silent war for the human soul. His followers didn't just agree, they understood him on a level that bypassed logic, their devotion absolute and chilling. Cases began to cross my desk at Broadmoor. Not the usual schizophrenics or psychopaths. These patients were different. They were coherent, intelligent, but possessed by a singular, apocalyptic belief system that was internally consistent yet utterly detached from reality. They spoke of the silence not as peace, but as an entity. They talked of seeing the true shape behind the world and of a coming alignment where the worthy would be spared and the noisemakers would be silenced forever. They didn't respond to conventional therapy. When I tried deep analysis, it was like hitting a wall of polished obsidian. Their minds were not fractured, they were repurposed. And in their delusions, if that's what they were, I kept hearing echoes of Krantzoff's warning, anti-prophets. The signal wasn't a broadcast. It was a subtle, psychic tuning fork, resonating with a latent frequency planted in our species long ago, awakening a latent programming in a scattered few. The war for the mind had begun. And it wasn't fought with lasers on the moon. It was fought in our newspapers, on our televisions, in the quiet certainty of a growing number of eyes that held no fear, only a fervent, waiting knowledge. They walk among us. They look like us. But they serve a purpose seated in the dust of another world, a purpose we were deemed too primitive to understand, only to enact. Krantzoff's warning was the last truth he ever gave me. The gift of technology had a price. We accepted the gift. Now, the collectors have come for their debt. And they are not collecting in dollars or rubles. They are collecting souls. And the most terrifying part? We're helping them do it. We call it zealotry, extremism, mental illness. We debate their points, we counter their arguments. We don't see the strings, pulsing with a faint, lunar light, connecting them to the silent, watching darkness we once dared to visit. The shadows we saw on the moon weren't invaders. They were shepherds. And the flock is stirring.